I do believe that my 2-year-old is a person. I believe that my 13-month-old is a person. And in November, when my wife gives birth to my 3rd child, because she informed me 3 days ago she's pregnant, I do believe that person is a person.
We all have eyes on Alabama, and we don't want these bills with personhood, language.
Impassioned speeches at the Iowa House of Representatives arguing over the wording of a bill that is designed to protect mothers and their unborn babies. This in response to the debate around in vitro fertilization that began in Alabama and spread nationwide. Critics of the bill, H.F. 2575, oppose changes to the current language. Right now, the bill outlines penalties for the termination of serious injury to a, quote, human pregnancy. Republicans want to update that language to unborn person. The bill was introduced well before the Alabama Supreme Court ruling and does not, in its current form, permit a prohibition on IVF. Iowa Republicans passed that bill late last week, making it a felony to cause the death of an unborn person. The legislation now heads to the state Senate as debate on the language continues. Meantime, the Departments of Defense and Veterans Affairs are expanding in vitro fertilization coverage for service members. Initially, it covered married heterosexual couples using their own sperm and egg. Now, unmarried couples, regardless of their sexual orientation, are covered, as well as single troops using donor eggs or sperm. The reforms were made in the wake of a lawsuit filed in August by Yale Law School and the National Organization for Women's New York chapter. As you can see, the recent Alabama Supreme Court case on in vitro fertilization ignited a firestorm of reactions across the U.S. A new law just signed by Alabama's governor grants legal immunity to IVF providers. But how does this come up against their state's recent Supreme Court ruling?
SB 159 has passed.
Senate Bill 159, the Senate concurs.
A near unanimous vote by the Alabama State Legislature advanced a new law on March 6th, protecting in vitro fertilization providers from criminal prosecution for the, quote, damage or death of an embryo. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey quickly signed the bill into law that evening. In a statement by Ivey, she said, quote, particularly in the heat of a national election, we will hear a lot of political rhetoric around IVF. Let me say clearly, Alabama supports growing families through IVF. She also said she hoped IVF businesses in the state that had stopped their services would immediately resume them. The law comes after the Alabama Supreme Court ruled embryos created by in vitro fertilization are human. The decision sparked national outrage from both sides of the aisle.
Hopeful moms are now being denied the chance to start a family through IVF.
I believe in the sanctity of every human life, always have. And because of that, I support IVF and its availability. It needs to be readily available.
And both presidential frontrunners.
I strongly support the availability of IVF for couples who are trying to have a precious little beautiful baby.
Guarantee the right to IVF. Guarantee it nationwide.
The ruling came in the wake of a lawsuit by 3 couples whose embryonic children were killed in a lab accident where they were being preserved frozen. Justices say their deaths violated the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act. Their decision reads in part, unborn children are children under the Act, without exception based on developmental stage, physical location, or any other ancillary characteristics.
But the Alabama Supreme Court ruling shows that these children die in huge numbers through the IVF process. And so that's a really great service, I think, to the public.
Many argue that couples who struggle with infertility need IVF to fulfill their dreams of starting a family. Still others claim that this Alabama court decision could ban IVF across America. But Dr. Monique Ruberu, a fertility expert and pro-life advocate, says otherwise.
There are so many women that I have helped in my office who had issues with their fertility, and when they went through IVF, they were basically labeled as unexplained infertility. And there truly is no such thing as unexplained infertility. That's a complete lie. It just means that people haven't looked hard enough to find the cause.
IVF is opposed by the Catholic Church because it separates marriage and the procreative act. and destroys the youngest of children in their embryonic form. Carter Sneed, the director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame, expands on this.
Because IVF conceives children, because it doesn't involve the conjugal union of spouses to create this life, it is an imperfect and incomplete, problematic form of reproduction. So the church says we don't do that.
Stephanie Smith, president and CEO of the Alabama Policy Institute, joins us now to further explain what's happening in Alabama. Stephanie, thanks for joining me. Let's clear up the confusion. The Alabama State Supreme Court ruled that embryos are protected by law as children outside the womb. Courts don't pass laws, right? So what does this ruling actually mean? What will come of it?
Well, the ruling doesn't make IVF illegal in the state of Alabama, and it also didn't address necessarily the personhood question, but it did declare that the definition of minor children included frozen embryos. And so it came to the rescue of those parents who were part of the IVF process, whose children were unintentionally destroyed, but still destroyed. And unfortunately, the reaction from our legislative body to the judicial decision was not to protect life and was not to protect even the people going through the IVF process. It was to protect the clinics that actually create this procedure within the confines of our state. And so the Senate bill that passed gave blanket immunity criminally and civilly to those clinics and also to those involved with the clinics. Rather than protecting life, they chose to protect the clinics.
It's concerning. And lawmakers, as you're alluding to, they really jumped to protect these IVF providers. But does their law actually relate to the specifics of the state Supreme Court's decision? How do those kind of stack up next to one another?
Right. I mean, I guess that kind of remains to be seen. I think that the reaction from the legislative body was more a reaction to the crisis that was created by the closure of the clinics. There were 3 clinics that immediately closed to protect themselves and the liability to themselves. The frustration from a policy standpoint was that's actually not what the Supreme Court decision did. That was they did that on their own volition and created their own crisis intentionally. And our concern is with life. Our concern is to make sure that women and children in all stages are protected in the reproduction process. And our concern is more about the children and the families involved and less about protecting the clinics.
It's very interesting, the point you made that they created their own crisis, these IVF providers. Thank you for clarifying that. Stephanie, does this law change what happens now to all of the embryos that IVF providers tend to throw away or perform tests on or just kind of leave to thaw out and die?
It basically allows the IVF clinics to do whatever they want. Like I said, from a policy perspective, the frustrating thing for us is that it sidestepped the policy. The policy that needs to be addressed is if IVF is going to be a procedure that is legal in the states, there need to be parameters around it, and there need to be considerations for ethics. There need to be parameters around the possible eugenics that are happening in those procedures, and most of all, from our perspective, the mothers and the children involved in those processes need to be protected from being part of that process.
Sure. And Stephanie, you know probably better than anyone, Alabama is such a strongly pro-life state. So I'm curious, what are you hearing from Alabamians about all of this?
Yeah, I think that a lot of Alabamians were kind of fooled by the manufactured crisis. But as one of the strongest pro-life states in the nation, I feel strongly that we will further this process and use this negative situation as a Romans 8:28 moment, and and create something in the state of Alabama that is a truly pro-life piece of legislation.
Sure. Well, Stephanie Smith of the Alabama Policy Institute, thank you for joining us and for your pro-life work in your state.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.